Imagine, like, it's 1939,
Okay.
right? Germany is literally on the brink of the largest, I mean, the most devastating war in human history.
Yeah.
And their factories are just running 24/7. They are desperately short on workers to build the bombs, the tanks, the artillery shells, everything needed for this massive campaign.
They need hands on deck.
Exactly. And yet, there are millions of healthy, totally capable adult women who are legally and socially barred from helping on those assembly lines.
Which is wild.
And it's completely wild. Why? Because the government they'd spent the previous 6 years practically brainwashing themselves into a corner.
Right. I mean, it is one of the most stunning examples of like ideological self-sabotage in the 20th century.
Yeah.
The regime built this societal trap that was so effective, it ended up catching them instead of their enemies.
Totally. And look, if you are an IGCSE history student tuning in to prep for your exams right now, you really need to pay close attention to this paradox.
Absolutely.
Because it is like the absolute key to understanding the entire era. So today we are doing a deep dive into the role of women in Nazi Germany and the very specific, often totally contradictory policies the regime weaponized against them.
Mm-hmm.
We're pulling from a massive stack of historical sources today. We've got textbook pages outlining the laws, raw demographic data, quotes from the high command.
And the propaganda.
Yes, the visual propaganda they pumped into people's living rooms like the Frauenwort magazine.
Which, when you look at these documents side by side, it really reveals this chilling picture of a government trying to engineer human behavior.
Right.
Like you would engineer a factory floor.
Wow, yeah.
We're going to break down the mechanics of how they attempted this, the financial levers they pulled, and the brutal enforcement mechanisms they used when the propaganda just simply wasn't enough.
Okay, let's unpack this. By looking at why the Nazis were so utterly obsessed with women's roles, the literal moment they took power in 1933. Because they didn't just have, like, a conservative view of women. They treated the female population as an existential crisis that needed to be solved immediately.
Right, and to understand that panic, you really have to look at the demographic freefall that Germany was experiencing at the time.
Okay.
When Hitler came to power, the state was staring at some incredibly stark numbers.
Yeah.
If you go back to 1900,
Yeah.
the German birth rate was over 2 million live births a year.
2 million, okay.
But by 1933, that number had completely collapsed to under 1 million.
Really, under 1 million?
Under 1 million.
That is a staggering drop. I mean, they lost more than half of their population growth in just 3 decades.
Exactly. And compounding that sheer numerical drop was the devastating hangover of the First World War.
Oh, right, the casualties.
Yeah, the casualties from the trenches left this massive demographic void, specifically a massive shortage of young men.
Which means there's a shortage of marriages. Right.
Exactly. The sources indicate that because of this slaughter, there were roughly 1.8 million unmarried German women in the 1920s and 30s.
Wow.
Women who, in a traditional society would have been expected to marry and have children, but they simply had no prospective partners.
So from the perspective of the Nazi leadership, they're looking at this shrinking population that threatens their entire, megalomaniacal vision for a sprawling 1,000-year empire.
Right.
They need a massive future army to conquer Europe. And they're looking at the birth registries, realizing, well, they don't even have the raw numbers to sustain a local defense force, let alone an empire.
Exactly. For the totalitarian state, the maternity ward was viewed quite literally as a battlefield.
That's a dark way to put it, but yeah.
They needed that next generation of soldiers and mothers to be raised from birth entirely within their ideological framework.
Right.
And to achieve this, the state's official stance became this very rigidly defined, heavily promoted concept. They said women were, quote, different, not inferior.
Different, not inferior. It's such a calculated, insidious slogan.
It really is.
Because it sounds almost respectful on the surface, acknowledging different strengths, until you look at what their definition of different actually entail.
Oh, absolutely.
Their designated sphere for women was strictly, exclusively the home, producing children, looking after the husband, and nothing else.
Just that.
I'm looking at this quote from Joseph Goebbels, written in 1929, that just completely unmasks this mentality.
Go ahead.
He says, the mission of women is to be beautiful and to bring children into the world. This is not at all as unmodern as it sounds.
Which is already quite the statement.
Right. And then he goes on. The female bird pretties herself for her mate and hatches eggs for him. In exchange, the male takes care of gathering food and stands guard and wards off the enemy.
Wow. So he's reducing a highly complex industrialized European society to extreme biological determinism.
It's bizarre. Reading that Goebbels quote, it feels like a twisted, state-sponsored attempt to force an entire modern society back into a rigid, almost cartoonish nature documentary.
Yeah.
Like, it completely ignores the complexities of human economics or ambition or intellect. The female bird hatches the eggs, the male bird finds the worms. End of story.
And they enforce that female bird image down to the smallest, most personal details of daily life.
Like what?
Well, the regime instituted strict social rules regarding a woman's appearance to ensure she fit this submissive, quote-unquote, natural ideal.
Okay.
Women were actively discouraged from wearing makeup, trousers, or high
No
heels.
makeup at all.
No makeup. They were
So-
told to keep their hair in a simple bun or plaits and explicitly warned against dyeing or styling it.
They even went after personal habits, too, right? Because I know smoking and dieting were heavily frowned upon by the state.
Oh, heavily.
But not for the woman's own health. It was because the government deemed them, quote, bad for childbearing. It's like you weren't an individual person anymore. You were just a vessel for the state's future.
Right. But moving from the theory of this ideology to the actual mechanics of enforcement, it reveals a fascinating study in behavioral economics.
How so?
Well, you can't just mandate that millions of independent working women suddenly quit their jobs and embrace this nature documentary role overnight.
Right, they just laugh at you.
Exactly. You have to build a system of incentives.
You use carrots.
Yes, carrots.
And the overarching cultural carrot they dangled was wrapped up in this very traditional slogan that they plastered everywhere, which was Kinder, Küche, Kirche.
Right.
Children, kitchen, church. That was the celebrated trifecta of the ideal German woman.
But slogans don't pay the rent, though.
No, they don't.
If the state genuinely wanted women out of the workforce to, open up jobs for men and focus on having children, they had to incentivize it financially.
Right.
This is where we see the implementation of the 1933 law for the encouragement of marriage.
Okay, tell me about this one.
So this wasn't just a suggestion. It was a highly engineered piece of economic legislation. It offered a state-funded marriage loan of 600 marks to young couples.
Let's put that in perspective for a second for the listener.
Oh.
600 marks was roughly half a year's wages for an average worker.
Yeah.
That is a massive chunk of money to hand a newlywed couple.
A massive incentive, yes, but it came with a highly specific string attached.
Of course it did.
To qualify for the loan, the wife had to officially, legally give up her job and promise not to re-enter the labor market as long as her husband was earning an income.
So the state is directly, financially rewarding women for exiting the labor pool.
Exactly. But the engineering goes one step further. For every single child the couple had, they were legally permitted to keep 1/4 of that loan without ever paying it back.
Wait. So you have a baby, the government wipes out 25% of your debt.
Yes.
You have 4 children, the debt is entirely wiped clean.
Correct.
They basically turned human reproduction into a mortgage forgiveness program.
What's fascinating here is how the regime successfully monetized motherhood.
Yeah.
They turned the incredibly personal choice of starting a family into a transactional economic policy. And they supplemented the financial incentives with intense state-sponsored prestige.
Right, the medals. The Cross of Honor of the German mother.
Yes.
This concept is just wild to look back on. They awarded these medals every year in a massive public ceremony on August 12th.
Yep.
Which was, by the way, purposely chosen because it was Hitler's mother's birthday.
Of course it was.
It was structured exactly like the Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
You received a bronze medal for having 4 to 5 children, a silver medal for 6 to 7, and if you birthed 8 or more children for the state, you received the Gold Cross.
Wow.
Hitler Youth members were even instructed to salute women wearing the Gold Cross on the street.
It really represents the ultimate gamification of demographic growth.
Gamification, yes. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
And if we look strictly at the numbers, it was highly effective. By 1939, 3 million women had received a medal for having 4 or more children.
3 million.
And the birth rate, which we established had fallen under 1 million, surged. It went from 970,000 babies born in 1933 to over 1.4 million by 1939.
They truly pulled out all the stops to make this happen. I mean, they introduced family allowances for low-income households, and they even went so far as to change the national divorce laws in 1938.
Right.
The state made it so a divorce was legally permissible if a husband or wife couldn't have children.
Yeah, that's incredible.
They literally wrote infertility as grounds for marital termination into the legal code. Like, if the marriage wasn't producing soldiers, the state saw no reason for it to exist.
And for those who were unmarried, the state provided a deeply controversial alternative called the Lebensborn program.
Right, a fount of life.
Yes. This was a state-run initiative where specially chosen unmarried women could, in the regime's own twisted terminology, donate a baby to the Führer by becoming pregnant by supposedly racially pure SS men in dedicated, comfortable maternity homes.
Okay, wait, I'm stuck on something here.
Sure.
You just said they were pushing this ultra-conservative, traditional narrative, Kinder, Kusha, Kirsche, children, kitchen, church.
Right.
How on earth did they justify the Lebensborn program to the public? Having unmarried women sleep with SS officers goes entirely against traditional Christian morals. How did a deeply conservative society reconcile that?
That is the crucial friction point of Nazi ideology. It exposes the hierarchy of their beliefs.
Oh.
When traditional morality clashed with their obsession with race and population growth, race won every single time.
Oh.
They managed the public relations of the Lebensborn program by cloaking it in extreme patriotism. The state essentially argued that producing an Aryan child was a duty so sacred, it superseded traditional religious marriage laws.
Unbelievable.
It really highlights how the church aspect of their slogan was merely a tool for control, easily discarded when it didn't serve their biological goals.
That is a terrifying level of ideological flexibility.
It is.
Because on paper, with the loans and the medals, it looks like this massive state-funded celebration of the family.
Mm-hmm.
But digging into who actually qualified reveals the dark, horrific flip side of this entire system.
We have to ask who was allowed to participate in this state-funded family boom.
Right.
The rewards were strictly limited to those producing, quote, healthy Aryan children. If you did not fit that impossibly narrow racist definition, you were aggressively excluded.
Right.
Jewish people, for example, were legally banned from receiving the marriage loans.
And it wasn't just exclusion, right? It was active, violent suppression.
Yes.
Which brings us to the reality of Nazi eugenics. In 1933, the exact same year they started handing out marriage loans to encourage births, they passed the sterilization law.
Yeah.
This legislation allowed for the forced surgical sterilization of anyone the state deemed to have a hereditary disease or mental deficiency. They set up actual hereditary health courts, like tribunals, of doctors and lawyers deciding who was allowed to reproduce.
The scale of that medical violence is just difficult to comprehend. The sources confirm that by 1945, over 320,000 men and women in Germany had been sterilized against their will.
320,000.
Yes. And then, in 1935, they compounded this with the marriage health law. This placed an intense legal stress on racial purity.
Right.
If you were applying to get married, you were legally required to inquire into your spouse's forebears, digging through genealogies to ensure you had similar or related blood.
And look at the hypocrisy surrounding bodily autonomy here. For women deemed Aryan, anti-abortion laws were fiercely enforced, and contraceptives were made incredibly difficult to obtain.
Right, you had to have the baby.
You were forced to carry the child. But for women deemed undesirable, the state actively forced sterilization or abortion. The government just seized absolute control over human reproduction.
So what happened to the women who refused to conform? The women who weren't the ideal submissive housewives or who actively opposed the regime politically.
Out comes the stick.
Exactly.
For women who didn't fit the mold, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, abortionists, Jewish women, the state built specific concentration camps.
Mm-hmm.
As early as October 1933, they opened Moringen, which was the first concentration camp exclusively for women.
Wow.
And later, in 1939, they opened Ravensbrück. This wasn't just a prison. It was a site of brutal forced labor and horrific conditions. By the end of 1939, Ravensbrück held over 2,000 prisoners, including some 400 Roma and Sinti women.
Comparing the reality of Ravensbrück to the propaganda being consumed by the general public exposes the immense cognitive dissonance required to live in that society.
It's mind-boggling. I mean, I'm looking at this propaganda poster from the Frauenwort magazine, their official state-sponsored women's magazine. The cover shows this idyllic, sunlit, blonde family. The mother is holding a chubby, smiling baby. The father is standing guard in the background. It's a literal illustration of Goebbels' female birth.
Exactly.
But while they're printing millions of copies of these smiling families and handing out gold medals, they are simultaneously laying the bricks for Ravensbrück.
It shows how entirely manufactured and violently enforced this ideal really was.
Yeah,
But you can't just flip a switch on adult women who are already used to having jobs and independence and political opinions.
right. They remember before.
Exactly. If a regime wants this kind of radical societal shift to stick permanently, they have to get to the kids before they know any better.
The indoctrination of the youth.
Yes.
The state was incredibly methodical about capturing the minds of girls as early as possible. They set up specific organizations based entirely on age.
Hmm.
You had the Young Mädelbund, the Young Girls League for
Yeah.
ages 10 to 14.
Right.
Then they graduated into the Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM, for ages 14 to 18. And finally, Glaube und Schönheit, Faith and Beauty, for 18 to 21-year-olds.
And the explicit documented goal of the BDM was to educate these girls in family life, to make them physically healthy, and to prepare them mentally to produce children.
Of course.
They were taught household skills, rigorous physical health regimens, and subjected to just endless ideological lectures.
Yeah.
However, examining the historical records of how these groups actually functioned reveals a profound structural flaw in the Nazi plan.
This raises an important question. If your ultimate goal is to train girls to be quiet, isolated, submissive housewives, why would you take them away from the traditional family structure to do it?
That is the paradox of totalitarian youth movements. To indoctrinate these girls, the BDM had to remove them from the influence of their parents.
Right.
They took them out of their homes for camping trips, cross-country hikes, and massive energetic rallies.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
If you lived in a small, traditional countryside village where women had always just stayed in the home, suddenly the state is telling you to pack a bag, leave your parents, and go hiking across the country with a huge group of girls your own age.
Yeah.
They were giving these young women unprecedented independence, leadership roles within their troops, and thrilling new experiences outside their villages. But all under the guise of training them for domestic submission.
And it backfired culturally.
Of course it did.
The state put young women in uniforms, taught them group solidarity, took them out of their isolated villages, and then expected them to happily retreat back into their kitchens at age 18 and never question male authority again.
Right.
You cannot spark independent thought and group power and then demand total silence.
And we know from the sources they didn't always stay quiet.
No, they didn't.
There's this amazing anecdote from a BDM member named Marianne Gartner recalling a meeting in 1936. The team leader is giving them this intense brainwashing lecture, raising her voice, saying, "There is no greater honor for a German woman than to bear children for the Führer. The Führer has ruled that no family is complete without at least 4 children. A German woman does not use makeup." Just, hammering the party line.
How did Gartner react to this lecture?
She daringly raised her hand in front of the whole group and asked, "Why isn't the Führer married and a father himself?"
Wow, which is a brilliant observation, but incredibly dangerous in that political climate.
Extremely dangerous.
It perfectly illustrates the tension. The youth were being taught to worship a leader who didn't even follow his own rigid demographic rules.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because all of this meticulous social engineering, the marriage loans, the medals, the youth camps,
Yeah.
it all collides head-on with cold, hard reality as the decade comes to a close.
Ah, yes, the great U-turn.
Yep.
The moment the ideology crashed into economics.
So in the early 1930s, the Nazis were ruthless about purging professional women from their careers. Doctors, lawyers, civil servants, teachers, they were systematically forced out.
Mm-hmm.
The state capped female university enrollment at a mere 10%.
Wow.
By 1936, a woman couldn't even serve as a judge or sit on a jury because the regime claimed they couldn't think rationally. The message was absolute. Get out of the public sphere, give your job to an unemployed man, and go home.
But the geopolitical landscape shifts dramatically.
Right, 1939 is approaching.
Exactly. By 1937 and moving into 1939, Germany is rapidly rearming. They are preparing for a massive continental war of aggression.
Yeah.
The men are being pulled out of the factories, off the farms, and drafted into the expanding army. Suddenly, the German economy is facing a catastrophic labor shortage.
Whoops.
The factories producing the munitions, the weapons, the supplies for this impending war, they are empty.
Hitler's own rigid gender ideology completely trapped the Nazi war machine.
It did.
They desperately needed millions of women back in the factories to build the weapons.
Yeah.
But they had spent the last 6 years arresting people who disagreed with them, passing laws, and plastering the country with posters insisting that a woman's place is in the home holding a baby, not in a vacantry holding a wrench.
Right.
You can't just undo a half-decade of totalitarian brainwashing overnight.
The hypocrisy had to become official state policy.
Yeah.
They frantically reversed course. The marriage loans, the very loans that incentivized women to quit working, were abolished.
Just gone.
Gone. They introduced a compulsory duty year for all women entering employment, which usually meant manual labor on farms or in private homes just for bed and board, trying to plug the gaps in the labor force.
They were scrambling.
Mm-hmm.
And the numbers tell the whole story of this massive ideological failure. After all the propaganda, all the gold medals, all the Goebbels speeches about female birds, female employment in Germany actually shot up.
Yeah.
It went from 11.6 million working women in 1933 to 14.6 million in 1939.
That is a staggering statistic. There were 1.2 million more women working in Germany after 6 years of Nazi rule than there had been before Hitler took power.
Incredible.
The policy achieved the exact opposite of its stated goal.
But what's really crucial here, especially if you're writing an IGCSE exam essay on this topic, is that despite this massive, desperate labor shortage, the Nazis were so trapped by their own ideology that they never introduced female conscription for work or the armed forces.
And that is a vital point of comparison.
Right.
Look at Britain during the same period. The British government systematically drafted women into wartime factory work, agriculture, and auxiliary military roles. It was a total mobilization of the population. The Nazi regime refused to force the issue officially.
They couldn't.
They pleaded, they begged, they created the duty year, but they couldn't bring themselves to officially legally conscript women into the war effort because it would mean admitting their entire societal philosophy was wrong. Their ideological commitment to the Kinder, Küche, Kirche fantasy ultimately hamstrung their own military-industrial complex.
So for you listening, as you review your notes for this era, you have to center your understanding on this tension.
Absolutely.
It's the story of a state that had an absolute fanatical obsession with domesticity and boosting the birth rate in the early 30s, followed by a panicked, hypocritical reversal in the late 30s when the reality of war demanded factory workers. They tried to engineer a society based on a twisted fairy tale, and the brutal reality of wartime economics crushed it.
It leaves us with a much broader historical thought to consider.
What's that?
When we look at the mechanics of this, the 600-mark marriage loans, the medals for childbirth, the precise tracking of birth rates, the hereditary health courts, we are looking at a regime that aggressively controlled the most intimate personal details of human life.
Marriage, birth, family.
Exactly. They weaponized all of it simply to serve the state's economic and military spreadsheet. If a government is willing to do that, what happens to a society's basic humanity when its people are no longer viewed as individual human beings with their own agency, but merely as biological resources to be harvested for a national agenda?
Wow. It changes how you view every piece of propaganda from that era. They didn't see mothers or families. They just saw parts for a machine.
Right.
And as the history shows, when you build a machine using the wrong blueprints, trying to force human beings to act like clockwork birds, the machine ultimately breaks itself. Good luck with your studying. Keep digging into the why behind the facts, and we'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.